Every species in the galaxy had a story about how they joined the Galactic Council. The Valori were invited after they mastered faster-than-light communication. The Dravine earned their place by conquering 3-star systems and proving their military strength. The Zythani were welcomed because their merchant fleets connected 100 worlds through trade. Every species had a story. Every species had a moment where the galaxy opened its arms and said, "You belong here." But when the humans finally left their little blue world and knocked on the door of the stars, the galaxy did not open its arms. The galaxy locked the door. And that was the first mistake. There is something you should understand before this story goes any further. The galaxy is not a kind place. It never was. The Galactic Council liked to present itself as a government of peace and cooperation, a grand assembly of civilizations working together for the betterment of all sentient life. That was the speech they gave at every summit. That was the line printed on every diplomatic charter. But behind the polished words and ceremonial robes, the Galactic Council was a machine built on one simple rule. Power flows upward, and those at the bottom stay at the bottom. The strong species made the laws. The weak species followed them. And if a new species appeared that did not fit neatly into the system, the Council had ways of dealing with that too. Humans did not fit neatly into the system. When the first human ship crossed the border of Council-monitored space, it was a small vessel, nothing impressive by galactic standards. It carried a crew of 42, a basic fusion drive, and enough supplies for a one-way trip into the unknown. The ship was called the Meridian, and it had been built not by any government, but by a coalition of universities and private donors on Earth who believed that the stars were worth reaching even if the journey killed them. That attitude alone should have been a warning. The Valori Border Patrol intercepted the Meridian 3, light years past the edge of what humans called the Oort Cloud. Commander Thesson of the Valori 3rd Fleet was the first alien to ever speak to a human being. The conversation was short. Thesson asked the humans to identify themselves, their world of origin, and their purpose. Captain Elena Vasquez of the Meridian answered all 3 questions calmly and clearly. She said they were humans from the planet Earth. She said they had come in peace. She said they were looking for others like themselves, thinking beings who looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Thesson found the answer amusing. He noted in his report that the humans seemed naive but harmless. He recommended standard first contact protocol, observation, assessment, and eventual integration into the Council's lower tier of associate species. His superiors agreed. A diplomatic envoy was dispatched. The humans were told that they had been noticed and that the Galactic Council would decide their place in the larger civilization. For the next 5 years, the Council studied humanity. They sent researchers to Earth. They monitored human communications. They catalogued human history, culture, technology, biology, and psychology. And when the final report was delivered to the Council's inner chamber, the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy sat together and read it in silence. The report said many things. It said that humans were physically unremarkable, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most durable species the galaxy had ever produced. It said that human technology was primitive by Council standards, roughly equivalent to what the Dravine had possessed 4,000 years ago. It said that human society was fractured, divided into hundreds of competing nations, languages, and belief systems. It said that humans had a troubling history of violence against their own kind, including wars, genocides, and environmental destruction on a scale that shocked even the Dravine, who were not easily shocked. But the report also said something else. It said that humans were adaptable in ways that did not make sense. It said that human beings could survive in almost any environment, could learn almost any skill, could recover from almost any injury, physical or psychological, and continue functioning. It said that humans formed social bonds of extraordinary strength, and that these bonds could motivate behavior that defied rational self-interest. It said that humans had a concept they called spite, which meant that a human being would sometimes endure great suffering not for any personal gain but simply to prevent an enemy from winning. The researchers who wrote that section of the report had underlined the word spite 3 times. The Council read the report. They discussed it for 6 days. And at the end of those 6 days, the inner chamber made a decision that would later be recognized as the most catastrophic mistake in galactic history. They classified humanity as a Tier 7 species. In the Council system, Tier 1 was the highest rank, reserved for the founding species, the ones who had built the Council and written its laws. Tier 7 was the lowest, Tier 7 species had no vote, no representation, no rights under Council law. They were permitted to exist within Council space, but only under strict conditions. They could not expand their territory. They could not develop military technology beyond what the Council approved. They could not establish independent trade agreements with other species. They were, in every way that mattered, property of the Council. The human ambassador to the Council at that time was a man named David Okafor. He was a former professor of international law who had been chosen for the role because of his patience, his intelligence, and his ability to remain calm in impossible situations. When he received the Council's classification decision, he read it carefully. Then he read it again. Then he put the document down, removed his glasses, and sat in silence for a very long time. Okafor understood what Tier 7 meant. It meant that humanity would be a servant species. It meant that Earth would be a resource colony. It meant that every human being alive and every human being who would ever be born would live under the authority of aliens who had decided, after 5 years of study, that humans were not worth respecting. He sent a message back to Earth. The message was simple. It said, "They have made their decision. They do not see us as equals. Advise." The response from Earth took 11 hours to arrive because of the communication delay. When it came, it was not from any single government. It was a joint statement from every nation on Earth, the first truly unified human declaration in the history of the species. It said, "We do not accept." Okafor delivered this response to the Council personally. He stood before the inner chamber, 12 species who controlled the fate of 1,000 worlds, and he told them that humanity rejected their classification. He told them that humans would not surrender their sovereignty, their freedom, or their future. He told them that if the Council wished to impose its will on humanity by force, it was welcome to try. The Council members looked at each other. Several of them laughed. The Dravine ambassador, a towering creature with 4 arms and skin like polished stone, leaned forward and asked Okafor if he understood what he was saying. The Dravine military alone had 10,000 warships. Earth had none. Okafor said he understood perfectly. The Council gave humanity 1 standard galactic year to reconsider. They called it a grace period. They said it was an act of mercy, a chance for this young and foolish species to accept reality before reality was forced upon them. Okafor thanked them for their generosity and returned to Earth. What happened during that 1 year is something the galaxy would later study with a mixture of horror and admiration. Earth did not spend that year negotiating. Earth did not spend that year begging for better terms. Earth spent that year preparing. The nations of Earth had never agreed on anything before. Not fully, not completely, not without reservations and arguments and compromises that left everyone unhappy. But the Council's ultimatum did something that no human leader, no human movement, no human cause had ever managed to do. It united the species. Every government on Earth signed the Compact of Terra, a document that dissolved all national militaries and merged them into a single force, the Terran Defense Authority. Every scientist, every engineer, every factory, every resource on the planet was redirected toward one goal: survival. The humans reverse-engineered every piece of alien technology they had acquired during the 5 years of contact. They studied the Valori communication arrays. They analyzed the Council's scanning equipment. They took apart a diplomatic shuttle that had been left in Earth orbit and rebuilt it 6 times until they understood every component. Human engineers did not just copy what they found. They improved it. They asked questions that the original designers had never thought to ask. And they found answers that the original designers would not have believed. In 12 months, Earth went from a planet with no starships to a planet with a fleet. It was not a large fleet. It was not a pretty fleet. The ships were rough and ugly, and held together with solutions that made alien engineers weep with confusion. But they worked. They flew. And they carried weapons. The weapons were the part that worried the Council when they finally learned about them. Human beings had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other. They had invented gunpowder, machine guns, nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, biological agents, drone warfare, and psychological operations. They had studied destruction the way other species studied mathematics, with passion, creativity, and relentless innovation. When humans turned that expertise toward building weapons that could operate in space, the results were terrifying. 1 year after the Council's ultimatum, a Dravine battle fleet of 200 warships arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system. Their commander, Admiral Korthax, sent a standard submission demand. He told the humans to surrender immediately, dismantle their unauthorized military, and accept Tier 7 classification. He told them that resistance would result in the destruction of their homeworld. Captain Elena Vasquez, the same woman who had commanded the Meridian on its first journey into the stars, answered the transmission. She was now the commander of Earth's first fleet, 23 ships that looked like they had been built in a junkyard. She told Admiral Korthax that humanity did not recognize the Council's authority. She told him that Earth's solar system was sovereign human territory. She told him that if his fleet advanced 1 light-minute closer, she would consider it an act of war. Korthax laughed. His officers laughed. 200 Dravine warships against 23 human vessels that could barely hold atmosphere. It was not a battle, it was a joke. Korthax ordered his fleet to advance. The Battle of the Oort Line lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 167 Dravine warships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 33 were in full retreat, broadcasting distress signals on every frequency. Admiral Korthax was dead, his flagship torn apart by a weapon the Dravine had never seen before, a kinetic accelerator that fired tungsten rods at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The humans called them railguns. The Dravine called them the end of everything they knew about war. Elena Vasquez lost 4 ships, 89 human lives. She recorded the names of every person who died that day and transmitted the list to Earth. Then she turned her fleet toward Council space and sent a message on an open channel that every species in the galaxy could hear. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Defense Authority. We did not ask for this war. We did not choose this war, but we will finish it. To every species listening, we are not your enemies. We are not conquerors. We are human beings. We wanted to be your friends. You made us something else. And now you will learn what that something else can do. The Galactic Council received this transmission in real time. For the first time in 4,000 years, the inner chamber was silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they were afraid. The galaxy had declared war on humanity. It was only now beginning to understand what that meant. News of the Battle of the Oort Line traveled across the galaxy at the speed of panic. Every species heard it. Every government discussed it. Every military commander in Council space pulled up the combat data and stared at it until their eyes hurt because the numbers simply did not make sense. 200 Dravine warships, the finest killing machines in the galaxy, crewed by warriors bred for combat over 10,000 generations, had been torn apart in 11 minutes by a species that had learned to fly between stars barely 2 years ago. It was not supposed to be possible. It broke every model, every prediction, every assumption the galaxy had ever made about how power worked. And that was exactly why it terrified them. The Council's response was immediate and furious. Within 3 days of the battle, the inner chamber convened an emergency session. The Dravine demanded blood. Their ambassador, a scarred veteran named General Morvath, stood before the assembly and declared that the destruction of the human homeworld was not just a military necessity, but a moral obligation. He said that any species capable of that level of violence in its infancy would become an existential threat if allowed to mature. He said that Earth must burn before the humans learn to build something worse than railguns. The Valori ambassador counseled caution. She reminded the chamber that the humans had sent an open transmission offering peace. She suggested that perhaps the Council should reconsider its approach and negotiate with humanity as equals. Her words were met with cold silence. The Dravine general turned his 4 eyes toward her and asked if the Valori had forgotten who built this council and who maintained order in the galaxy. The Valori ambassador said nothing more. The vote was unanimous. The Galactic Council declared total subjugation protocol against humanity, the highest level of military response in Council law. It had been used only twice before in galactic history, both times against species that had attempted to overthrow the Council. Both of those species no longer existed. Their worlds were now mining colonies. Their names were footnotes in history books that nobody read. The Council assembled the largest military fleet ever gathered under a single command. 12 species contributed ships. Over 4,000 warships drawn from every corner of Council space. The fleet was placed under the command of Supreme Admiral Veltraxis of the Zythani, a strategist who had never lost a battle in 90 years of service. Veltraxus was old, careful, and brilliant. He did not underestimate the humans the way Corthax had. He studied every piece of data from the Ortline battle. He analyzed human tactics, human weapons, human psychology. He spent 3 weeks developing a battle plan that accounted for every variable he could imagine. But there were variables he could not imagine because Veltraxus was not human. While the Council built its fleet, humanity was not standing still. The Terran Defense Authority had used the weeks after the Ortline victory to expand at a pace that would have been impossible for any other species. Human shipyards on Earth, on the Moon, on Mars, and on 3 hastily constructed orbital stations were producing new vessels around the clock. Human workers did not sleep in shifts. They simply did not sleep. Stimulant drugs, rotating crew rotations, and a grim understanding that extinction was the alternative kept the factories running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But ships alone would not win this war. David Okafor, who had transitioned from ambassador to head of Terran Strategic Intelligence, understood that humanity could not match the Council in raw numbers. 4,000 warships against perhaps 100 human vessels. The math was brutal. Humanity needed something more than firepower. It needed allies. Okafor had spent years studying the Council's internal politics, and he knew something that most species preferred to ignore. The Council was not a family. It was a prison. The Tier 1 species ruled. The lower tiers obeyed. And among the lower tiers, there was a deep, quiet, smoldering resentment that had been building for centuries. The Keth were a Tier 5 species, insectoid beings who lived in vast underground colonies and possessed an extraordinary talent for engineering. The Council used the Keith as laborers. They built the stations, maintained the infrastructure, and repaired the ships that the Tier 1 species used to maintain control. In return, the Keth received the right to continue existing. That was the deal, work or die. The Keth had accepted it for 800 years because they had no choice. Okafor contacted the Keth through back channels. He did not promise them freedom. He was too honest for that. He told them that humanity was going to fight the Council and that humanity might lose. But he also told them that if humanity won, the Keth would never build another warship for a species that treated them like tools. He asked for nothing specific. He simply planted a seed and waited. The R'Lani were a Tier 6 species, aquatic beings from a world of endless oceans who had been conquered by the Dravine 3 centuries ago. Their planet was now a water extraction facility that supplied Dravine colonies across 2 sectors. The R'Lani had no military, no political voice, and no hope. When Okafor reached out to them, they did not believe him at first. They thought it was a trap. It took 4 separate communications before the R'Lani Elder Council agreed to even listen. Okafor told them the same thing he had told the Keth. He did not make grand promises. He said, "We are going to fight. If we win, things change. If we lose, they stay the same. You have nothing to risk by hoping." There were others. The Thesserai, a Tier 4 species of telepaths who had been forbidden from using their abilities by Council law because the Tier 1 species feared what telepathy could do in the wrong minds. The Vorok, a nomadic Tier 5 species whose migration routes had been restricted to a single system because the Council decided their wandering was inefficient. The Drasi, a Tier 6 species so thoroughly conquered that most galactic citizens had forgotten they existed. Okafor contacted all of them. He did not build an army. He built a network, and he did it so quietly that the Council never noticed. Supreme Admiral Veltraxus launched his campaign against humanity on a date that the Council called Day of Correction. His fleet of 4,000 warships entered human-controlled space in a formation designed to overwhelm and surround. Veltraxus had divided his force into 3 groups, a central hammer of 2,000 ships aimed directly at Earth, and 2 flanking forces of 1,000 ships each, positioned to cut off any human retreat and prevent reinforcements from reaching the homeworld. It was a classic Council battle strategy, one that had crushed every enemy it had ever been used against. The humans did not retreat. They did not try to reinforce Earth. Instead, they did something that Veltraxus had not predicted, because no species in galactic history had ever been reckless enough to try it. They attacked in all directions at once. Elena Vasquez had divided humanity's fleet into dozens of small strike groups, some as few as 3 ships, none larger than 15. These groups did not engage Veltraxus's main fleet. They ignored it completely. Instead, They scattered across Council space like sparks from a fire and began hitting targets that had nothing to do with the war's front lines. Human strike groups attacked supply depots. They hit communication relays. They destroyed fuel stations, shipyard facilities, and logistics hubs that the Council fleet depended on for resupply. They did not try to hold any of these positions. They struck, they burned, and they vanished before the enemy could respond. The humans called it guerrilla warfare. They had been practicing it on each other for thousands of years. Veltraxus found himself commanding the largest fleet in galactic history against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. His warships were designed for massive fleet engagements, organized, predictable, honorable battles between great armadas. Instead, he was chasing ghosts. Every time he moved to intercept a human strike group, two more appeared somewhere else. His supply lines were crumbling. His communication network was fragmenting. His fleet was burning fuel faster than it could be replaced because the fuel depots kept exploding. And then the real problem began. On the Keth homeworld, deep in the underground factories where thousands of Keth workers assembled components for Council warships, production stopped. Not because of any attack, not because of any malfunction. The Keth simply stopped working. Every factory, every assembly line, every maintenance facility on every Keth colony went silent on the same day at the same hour. 800 years of obedient labor ended in a single coordinated act of refusal. The Council demanded an explanation. The Keth Elder, a being whose name translated roughly as one who remembers everything, responded with a single sentence: "We are tired." The R'Lani stopped pumping water 3 days later. The Dravine colonies that depended on R'Lani water began rationing immediately. But rationing could only last so long. Without water, the colonies would die within weeks. The Thessari broke their silence next. They had been forbidden from using telepathy, but they used it now, broadcasting a psychic message that every telepath-sensitive species in the galaxy could feel. The message was not words. It was an emotion. It was the feeling of a chain breaking. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was hope, raw and overwhelming, and it spread through the lower-tier species like fire through dry grass. Veltraxus was losing the war, and he had not yet fought a single major battle. His fleet was intact, his weapons were loaded, his warriors were ready, but the infrastructure behind him was collapsing. Ships could not be repaired because the Keth had stopped working. Fuel could not be sourced because the supply depots were burning. Communications were unreliable because the relay network was in pieces, and the species that formed the backbone of the Council's economy were rising up. Not with weapons, but with something far more dangerous: the simple decision to stop cooperating. The Supreme Admiral was not a fool. He recognized what was happening. The humans had not just attacked the Council's military. They had attacked its foundation. They had found every crack in the system, every injustice, every grievance, every broken promise, and they had turned those cracks into fractures. The Council was not being defeated in battle. It was being pulled apart from the inside. Veltraxus sent a message to the inner chamber, requesting permission to withdraw and regroup. The Dravine refused. General Morvath called Veltraxus a coward and demanded that he press the attack on Earth regardless of the supply situation. The Zithani trade guilds, who were watching their merchant routes dissolve as lower-tier species refused to transport goods, demanded that the fleet be redeployed to protect commercial interests. The Valori ambassador, breaking her silence for the first time since the war began, proposed an immediate ceasefire and negotiations with humanity. The inner chamber argued for 9 days. While they argued, the human strike groups continued their campaign. Elena Vasquez personally led an attack on the Dravine Military Academy at Korath Station, the oldest and most prestigious military institution in the galaxy. She did not destroy it. She disabled its defenses, landed a shuttle on its central platform, and broadcast a message to every cadet inside. "You were taught that strength is the only thing that matters," she said. "You were taught that the strong rule and the weak serve. Look around you. Your station is disabled. Your fleet cannot reach you. Your supply lines are gone. And the species you called weak are the ones who brought you here. Strength is not what you were told it is. Think about that." Then she left. She did not fire a single shot at the academy. She did not take prisoners. She did not demand surrender. She simply delivered a message and vanished back into the dark between stars. That broadcast was heard across the galaxy. It was replayed billions of times. For the lower-tier species, it was a declaration of possibility. For the Tier 1 species, it was a humiliation so profound that some of them could not even discuss it without shaking. Veltraxis made his decision without waiting for the inner chamber to finish arguing. He pulled his fleet back to a defensive position around the Council's capital system and sent a personal message to David Okafor. The message said, "I am a soldier, not a butcher. I will defend the Council's home. I will not chase your shadows across the galaxy while the Foundation rots beneath my feet. If you want to end this, come to me. If you want to talk, I will listen." Okafor received the message and shared it with the Terran War Council. Elena Vasquez was present. So were the commanders of every human strike group, connected by faster-than-light communication links that human engineers had built using modified Valori technology. They discussed their options for 2 hours. The war was going well for humanity, but Okafor knew it could not last forever. Human ships were tough but not invulnerable. Every engagement cost lives, and humanity did not have lives to spare. The guerrilla campaign was effective, but it was exhausting the fleet. Crews were running on minimal sleep. Ships were accumulating damage that could not be fully repaired in the field, and the longer the war continued, the greater the chance that something would go catastrophically wrong. More importantly, Okafor understood something that pure military strategists sometimes missed. Winning the war was not enough. Destroying the Council would create a power vacuum that could plunge the galaxy into chaos. Thousands of species depended on Council infrastructure for trade, communication, and basic governance. If that infrastructure collapsed completely, the suffering would be immense, and it would not fall on the powerful. It would fall on the weak, the same species that humanity had inspired to resist. Okafor sent his reply to Veltraxis. "We will come to you, not to fight, to talk. But we will come with our fleet, and we will come with our allies. And when we sit at your table, we will sit as equals. That is not a request." Veltraxis read the message. He read it again. Then he did something that no Zythani Supreme Admiral had ever done in the history of the Council's military. He laughed, not in mockery, in something that might have been respect. "Come then," he replied. "Let us see if you are as brave at a negotiating table as you are in the void." The human fleet turned toward the Council's capital. Behind them, carried by hope and fury and the simple refusal to be silent any longer, came the ships of the Keth, the Rilani, the Thessari, the Vorok, and a dozen other species who had never been allowed to speak for themselves. They were not a military force. Most of them had no weapons at all. But they came anyway because for the first time in centuries, someone had told them that their voices mattered. The galaxy held its breath. The final act was about to begin. The Council's capital was a station called the Nexus. It hung in the center of the Thalvari system like a metal moon, massive and ancient, built over 3,000 years by the combined labor of 100 species. Its corridors stretched for thousands of kilometers. Its docking bays could hold entire fleets. Its central chamber, called the Grand Forum, was large enough to seat representatives from every known species in the galaxy. The Nexus was more than a political center. It was a symbol, a monument to the idea that the galaxy could be governed, that order could be maintained, that civilization could hold back the chaos of the void. For millennia, that symbol had held. Now, it was about to be tested in a way its builders never imagined. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the Thalvari system on a day that had no name yet, but would later be remembered as the most important day in galactic history. Elena Vasquez commanded the vanguard. 57 warships battered and scarred from weeks of continuous combat, their hulls patched with whatever materials the crews could find. Behind the warships came the civilian convoy, hundreds of ships from the Keth, the Relani, the Thessari, the Vorok, the Drathi, and others whose names most galactic citizens had never learned. Some of these ships were cargo haulers, some were passenger transports. A few were little more than sealed containers with engines strapped to the back. They were not impressive. They were not threatening, but they were there, and their presence said something that no weapon could express. Supreme Admiral Veltraxis had positioned his remaining fleet, still nearly 3,000 warships, in a defensive ring around the Nexus. His ships were armed, their weapons powered, their crews at battle stations. But Veltraxis had also done something unusual. He had opened a corridor through his defensive formation, a clear path from the system's edge to the Nexus itself. It was an invitation and a test. If the humans came through the corridor peacefully, they would reach the station. If they opened fire, his fleet would close the corridor and annihilate them. Vasquez saw the corridor. She understood what it meant. She ordered her fleet to lower their weapon signatures, not to power down entirely because she was brave but not stupid, but to reduce their offensive posture enough that the Zethani sensors would register the gesture. Then she flew her ship straight through the heart of the enemy fleet, 57 human warships passing between 3,000 alien vessels close enough that the crews could see each other through their viewports. No one fired. Not a single shot. The corridor held, and behind the warships the civilian convoy followed, hundreds of unarmed ships from a dozen species, sailing through a gauntlet of the most powerful military force in the galaxy, on nothing but faith. Veltraxus watched from his flagship. He had fought wars for 90 years. He had seen courage and cowardice in every form the galaxy could produce. But he had never seen anything like this. An entire species, along with all the allies they had gathered, voluntarily placing themselves within the killing range of an enemy fleet because they believed that talking was worth the risk of dying. He told his adjutant later that in that moment he understood why the humans had won. Not because of their weapons, not because of their tactics, because they were willing to gamble everything on the chance that their enemy might be better than expected. The docking bays of the Nexus were designed for the elegant diplomatic vessels of Tier 1 species, sleek, polished ships that announced wealth and power. They were not designed for human warships that looked like armored scrapyards or Keth transport barges that smelled of chemical fuel and underground soil. The station's docking systems had to be manually overridden by Keth engineers who had helped build them centuries ago and still knew every access code. There was a strange justice in that. David Okafor stepped onto the Nexus wearing a plain, dark suit. He had no ceremonial robes, no diplomatic insignia, no entourage of advisors and guards. He walked with Elena Vasquez on his right and a Keth elder named Chitrex on his left. Behind them came representatives of every species that had joined humanity's cause, a procession that stretched down the docking corridor and out of sight. They walked in silence through the halls of the most powerful political institution in the galaxy, past murals depicting the Council's founding, past statues of the great leaders of Tier 1 species, past display cases holding the treaties and charters that had governed the galaxy for millennia. The Grand Forum was already full. Representatives of every Tier 1 species were seated in their traditional positions, elevated platforms arranged in a semicircle around a central speaking floor. The arrangement was deliberate. The powerful looked down. Everyone else looked up. It had been designed that way on purpose 3,000 years ago, and no one had ever questioned it, until now. Okafor walked to the center of the speaking floor. He looked up at the 12 Tier 1 delegations. He looked at the Dravine, who had sent a fleet to subjugate his world. He looked at the Velori, who had found humanity first and reported them as harmless. He looked at the Zethani, whose Supreme Admiral had opened a corridor instead of a firing solution. He looked at all of them, these ancient and powerful civilizations that had built an empire and called it a community. Then he spoke. "My name is David Okafor. I represent the species known as humanity. I stand here with representatives of the Keth, the Relani, the Thessari, the Vorik, the Drathi, and 11 other species whose names many of you do not know. We are here because you gave us no choice. We asked to be your equals. You made us your servants. We asked for respect. You gave us a classification number. We asked for peace. You sent a fleet." He paused. The forum was silent. "I am not here to threaten you. I am not here to demand your surrender. I am not here to do to you what you tried to do to us. I am here because this system, this council, this structure, this way of organizing the galaxy is broken. It was broken before we arrived. We just made the cracks visible." General Morvath of the Dravine stood. His massive frame towered over the speaking floor even from his elevated platform. His voice was deep and edged with barely controlled fury. "You have destroyed our ships. You have humiliated our military. You have encouraged our labor species to rebel, and you dare stand in this forum and lecture us about what is broken?" Okafor looked up at the Dravine general. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. "Yes," he said, "I do. Because every species I brought with me today has a story about what your council did to them. The Keth built your stations with their own hands and were never thanked. The Relani had their oceans drained to water your colonies. The Thessari were told their own mines were illegal. The Vorok were locked in a cage and told it was a home. These are not complaints from enemies, General. These are testimonies from victims, and there are hundreds more species out there who are too afraid to speak because they have seen what happens to those who do. The forum erupted. Delegates shouted. Accusations flew between platforms. The Dravine demanded that Okafor be arrested. The Valori called for order. The Zithani sat in silence, watching everything with their calculating eyes. It was Veltraxus who restored order. The Supreme Admiral had entered the forum quietly and taken a position near the back. Now he stepped forward, and the room fell silent, because even in this political arena, military authority commanded respect. "I have fought this war," Veltraxus said. His voice was calm, measured, precise. "I have studied these humans. I have analyzed their strategies, their weapons, their psychology, and I will tell you what I have learned. They did not win because they are stronger than us. They did not win because their technology is superior. They won because they understood something about this council that we have spent 3,000 years pretending was not true." He turned to face the elevated platforms. "We built this council on hierarchy. We told ourselves it was necessary, that some species are more advanced, more capable, more deserving of power. And perhaps that was true once, in the beginning. But it became a lie a long time ago. We stopped elevating species based on merit and started keeping them down based on convenience. We used the Keth because their labor was cheaper than machines. We took from the Rulani because it was easier than developing our own resources. We silenced the Thessari because we were afraid of what they could do. This is not governance. This is exploitation. And the humans saw it for what it was the moment they arrived." General Morvath slammed his fist against his platform. "You would betray the council you swore to protect?" Veltraxus turned to face the general. "I swore to protect civilization, General, not a system that turns half the galaxy into servants. If that system must fall for civilization to survive, then I will watch it fall, and I will not mourn." The argument continued for hours. It continued for days. The Grand Forum became a battleground of words instead of weapons, and in many ways the battles fought there were more brutal than anything that had happened in space. Old alliances shattered. Ancient grievances surfaced. Species that had been silent for centuries found their voices and spoke truths that the Tier 1 delegations did not want to hear. Through all of it, Okafor remained on the speaking floor. He ate there. He slept there for a few hours at a time, sitting in a chair that a Keth engineer had built for him from spare parts. He was available to any delegate who wanted to talk, from any tier, from any species. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions instead of making demands. And slowly, painfully, a new shape began to emerge from the chaos. It was not Okafor who proposed the new structure. It was the Valori ambassador, the same one who had counseled caution at the beginning of the war and been silenced for it. She stood before the forum and presented what she called the Thalveri Accord, a complete restructuring of galactic governance based on principles that she had been developing quietly for decades, waiting for a moment when the galaxy might actually listen. The Accord eliminated the tier system entirely. Every species would have equal representation in a new governing body, not based on military power, not based on economic output, not based on how long they had been part of the council, but simply based on the fact that they existed and they were sentient. Disputes would be resolved through arbitration, not force. Resources would be shared through negotiated agreements, not extraction. Military forces would be maintained for collective defense, not for keeping lower species in line. The Dravine rejected the accord immediately. General Morvath called it the death of order and the birth of chaos. He said that without hierarchy, the galaxy would tear itself apart within a generation. He said that the strong had a duty to rule because the weak could not rule themselves. Elena Vasquez, who had been standing silently behind Okafor for the entire proceeding, stepped forward for the first and only time. She looked at General Morvath and said something that would be carved into the walls of the new forum when it was built. "General," she said, "the wheat just kicked your teeth in. Maybe it is time to reconsider your definitions." The forum laughed. Even some of the Dravine delegates smiled, though they tried to hide it. Morvath did not smile. He stared at Vasquez with something that might have been hatred or might have been the beginning of an understanding he was not yet ready to accept. The vote on the Thalveri Accord took place 17 days after the human fleet arrived at the Nexus. Every species present was allowed to vote, not just the Tier 1 delegations, but every delegate from every tier, including species that had never been permitted to speak in the Grand Forum before. The vote was not unanimous. The Dravine voted against it. 2 other Tier 1 species joined them, but the majority was overwhelming. The accord passed, and in passing, it dissolved the Galactic Council as it had existed for 3,000 years. The Galactic Council did not survive, but something else was born in its place. The new governing body was called the Galactic Assembly. It met in the same forum, but the elevated platforms were torn down. The new seating was arranged in a circle, with every delegation at the same level. The murals on the walls were not removed. They were kept as reminders of what had been, so that no one would forget how easy it was for civilization to become tyranny. David Okafor was offered the position of first speaker of the assembly. He declined. He said that a human should not lead a galactic government, that the whole point of what they had fought for was that no single species should hold that kind of power. The position went instead to Chitrex, the Keth Elder, who accepted it with a quiet dignity that moved even the Dravine delegates who had voted against the accord. Elena Vasquez returned to Earth. She resigned her military commission, went back to the university where she had studied astrophysics 20 years earlier, and took a teaching position. When her students asked her what it had been like to fight a galactic war, she told them the truth, that the fighting was the easy part and that the hard part was what came after, when you had to build something worth living in from the rubble of something that was not. Veltraxus retired from military service and spent his remaining years writing a comprehensive history of the war. His book, translated into every known language in the galaxy, was titled The Humans. The final chapter contained a passage that became one of the most quoted texts in galactic literature. "I have studied war for 90 years," Veltraxus wrote. "I have commanded fleets, conquered worlds, and watched civilizations fall. And in all that time, I never encountered a species that confused me the way the humans did. Their contradictions made flesh. They are capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often in the same breath. They destroy and they build. They hate and they love. They are the most fractured species I have ever studied, and also the most unified when they choose to be. I spent months trying to understand how a species so young and so divided could defeat the combined might of the galaxy. In the end, the answer was simple. They could not accept the idea that anyone had the right to tell them what they were worth. That refusal, that stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal, is the most powerful force I have ever encountered. More powerful than any fleet, more powerful than any weapon, more powerful than 3,000 years of galactic order. The humans did not defeat us with ships and guns. They defeated us with the unshakable belief that they deserved to stand. And in standing, they showed the rest of the galaxy that it was possible to stand too. The Dravine eventually signed the Thalvari Accord. It took them 4 years. General Morvath was not part of the delegation that signed. He had retired in protest and spent the rest of his life maintaining that the galaxy would collapse without a strong hand to guide it. It did not collapse. It changed. It grew. It became something messier and louder and more complicated than the old council had ever been. But it also became something the old council had never been. Fair. Years later, a monument was built at the exact coordinates where the Battle of the Oort line had taken place. It was a simple structure, a ring of steel floating in the void, large enough to be visible from a passing ship. Engraved on the inner surface in every language known to the galaxy were 2 sentences. They came in peace. They were not given peace. So they made it themselves. Below those words in smaller text were 89 names, the crew members who had died in the first battle of the war. The first humans to give their lives not just for their own species, but for the idea that no thinking being should be told it does not matter. Ships passing through that sector sometimes slow down when they reach the monument. They do not have to. There is no law requiring it, but they do it anyway, from every species, because some things do not need to be required. Some things are simply right. And somewhere, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star in an unfashionable arm of the galaxy, children still look up at the night sky and wonder what is out there. They do not know yet that the answer is everything. They do not know that their ancestors knocked on the door of the stars and when the door was locked, kicked it open. They do not know that the galaxy once tried to break them and that they refused to break, but they will learn. They always do. That is the thing about humans. They always learn.